Welcome to Psychanooga.
I am your co-host, Bethany Cawthorn.
And I'm your other co-host, James Grant.
Today, we are talking about self-diagnosis.
A mix between kind of personal experience of people I know either self-diagnosing themselves or others, and a more professional interest in kind of how that happens in the brain, because that's something we asked both our professors is why they think it happens on kind of a mental psychological level, why people feel drawn to do that. And I thought it was interesting that you could probably find a correlation between the fact that, well, it's a matter of opinion, the most frequently self-diagnosed disorders are also the most commonly diagnosed. So you could probably land on two sides of an argument of either saying, oh, they're just doing that because it's popular and that's what is so prevalent, or you could say it's the most common. Most people have it. There are going to be people out there who have it who don't have a professional diagnosis. So here's our interview with Dr. Kertay. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
For doing this. The question for this episode is focused on self-diagnosis.
Okay.
So to get us started off, I'll ask how often or how accurately does a self-diagnosis generally align with maybe a clinician's diagnosis?
The answer to that is really complicated, partly by the fact that there isn't really great reliability even between clinicians, much less between clinicians and the individual. So I honestly, I don't know the answer to that question. I think part of the problem is that, there's an old thing about how, in medical interns get all these diseases because they think that, they have a symptom and they must have this disease that they're studying. And I think there's a certain amount of that happens with psychological diagnoses as well, that, we have, I'm going to back up a second. Human beings really dislike ambiguity, and they want to have a label, they want to have a name, they want to have an explanation for something. So if I'm upset, I will look for an explanation. And if that explanation, if putting a label on it makes me feel better because I've got a name for it, then I'll do it. And that's, I think, probably mostly the basis of self-diagnosis is, well, I'm just giving a name to it because otherwise it's this amorphous, crummy feeling and I don't know how to think about it. I don't know what to call it. That's my best guess. I mean, this could just be that I'm not aware of the literature as much, but I haven't seen a whole lot of research into self-diagnosis in the way that you're talking about it, but it may be out there.
It seems to me that it's gotten more popular in the past few years, maybe the past 10 years, or maybe even with my generation. Do you have any idea why that would be?
To some extent, I think what's different about, again, I'm going to back up a second. Every generation has had its own unique set of challenges, right? So, and, there's nothing that, old people like to do better than, oh, you think you've got it tough, you should have seen the, blah, blah, blah. I do think that there's a unique set of challenges that is happening for the youngest generation that's like in school, in university, entering the workforce right now, your generation essentially, which is that no one has ever had before, which is that everything is electronic. And part of the problem is that, the news cycle when I was in college, the news cycle was, maybe a week. And on a really busy news cycle, it was 48 hours. Now it's about 48 seconds. And so part of the problem is that we're getting information so fast that you don't have time to process one piece of information before the next one's on top of you. And I think that creates a generalized sense of anxiety, worry, fear of missing out, all of those things, because if we're not constantly consuming information, we don't know what to do. I think that creates a kind of stress and anxiety that is I won't even say it's worse than other generations, but it's different. And I think partly because that social media communication is two-way, now we're talking about it more. We're not just taking like, I didn't talk to newspapers. I read the newspaper, right? It was one-way communication. Now unless I decided to write a letter to the editor. But now we're constantly not only taking in information, but we're reacting to it. We're feeding it back, and it's becoming this sort of echo chamber. And so there are good parts of that. I think it helps to reduce stigma to a certain extent of mental health. But it also, I think, lends itself to, this doesn't feel good, and so there must be something wrong with me, so I'm going to put a label on it, and I'm going to diagnose myself as having an anxiety disorder. Well, maybe you do and maybe you don't. Maybe you're anxious, and there's reasons for you to be anxious, but it really isn't a condition that impairs your functioning. So I wouldn't think of it as a diagnosis. I think all of that is happening simultaneously, and part of the problem for those of us in the field is that it's changing so fast that we can't keep up with it either, right? How do we help people with that?
Earlier we talked about the labeling and the need for a label or an explanation.
Yeah.
And then you just mentioned kind of maybe someone experiences a little bit of anxiety.
Yeah.
And then they want to go for a full diagnosis. Do you think that's the most common origin of a self-diagnosis, is seeing smaller forms of a problem and then saying, oh, I must have this larger problem?
Well, it's an interesting question, and I don't think I know the answer to that. One of the things that, because one of my areas of expertise is workplace mental health, I looked at the generational differences around COVID and the generations and who was talking about mental health and so forth. One of the things that we saw was that the youngest generation in the workforce, Gen Z, was the most likely to talk about mental health, but the least likely to seek traditional care. And so I'm not sure if what happens is that people then go get a diagnosis. I think it's more like, life is really chaotic. The future is uncertain. There's a whole lot going on. There's a lot of polarization in the culture. All of this information overload is going on. We're sharing everything on social media, and we put labels on it, but it's really just we're looking for an explanation for why we feel bad. And that gets into this whole question that I keep bringing up to my class is, well, at what point do we start to say, if everybody's abnormal, then what does it all mean, right? If we're all stressed, then maybe we need a different way to think about it. But the tendency is to put a label on things. We want to have a label because we believe that if we have a label, we can fix it. I don't know that that's working out really well, but I think that's happening.
And to wrap it up, you talked about how some people just maybe don't want to go out and seek that treatment, or maybe don't even have the resources to seek a treatment, seek a professional diagnosis. If they're doing this not just out of the need for an explanation, but an earnest attempt to label themselves and then find a solution based off of that label, do you have any broad suggestions for people who might be doing that?
Boy, I mean, that's the point at which, getting some kind of professional help really is what's needed. I think actually this is one place where the kind of, the explosion of various kinds of apps and online solutions and all that can be helpful. There's a lot that's wrong with it. But I think of mental health as being on a spectrum, for everything from, daily stress that's pretty normal, through psychological symptoms, through a diagnosable condition that will benefit from care. And I think the solutions need to match the level. So if it's stress, what you need is resources for stress management. There are a lot of apps. There are, meditation courses. There's physical exercise. I mean, one of the most powerful mechanisms that we have for improving emotional health is physical exercise. So I think that there are those kind of self-help resources that will help a lot of this. Psychological symptoms, it gets raise your hand if you haven't been anxious. Like, everybody's been anxious at some point. The question is, how much is it interfering with your life? The in-between place, I think, sometimes benefits from self-help and sometimes benefits from getting professional help. And if we actually have a diagnosable condition and it's really getting in the way of our life, I don't think there is a shortcut other than, finding some form of help. But unfortunately, that's in very short supply, partly because our answer to everything is we send everybody to therapy. And you don't need a therapist to do stress management. You need a therapist, a good therapist you need for somebody who's got something going on that really needs professional help. So I think that unfortunately, the answer to your question is there's a system problem that we have to address on a bigger scale. And I don't have good answers on a case-by-case individual basis. I know that's kind of a non-answer, but the fact of the matter is that it's hugely complicated. And I think if I have a criticism of psychology, it's that we often over-focus on the individual and we don't focus on the bigger societal, cultural parts of the problem that really at this point, really need to get fixed. And it varies. I mean, the appropriate interventions vary by generation, by the kind of problem it is. I mean, the answer is really, really complex, and we could do like 5 podcasts about that.
Well, thank you.
And now we will be talking to Dr. Hubert.
Sometimes there are real issues with lack of access to resources, and it's a tough position to be in. One thing I'll say is that I am very glad that UTC has a counseling center, and so I always encourage folks to go check that place out. It's free for students. You already paid for it as part of your tuition, so might as well use it.
Right.
Get your money's worth out of it. And so students do have access to that here on campus, but for folks in the community, or if you go back home and you're someplace that you don't have access, different situation. In that particular kind of circumstance, a few things I would mention. There's usually some kind of government or nonprofit resources available. And in the past, that has helped, but it's not always solved the problem, because especially here in Tennessee or in other places, we have a lot of rural areas where there's not a lot of those kind of agencies available. You end up having to travel to some kind of bigger town or city. Now that's changed a little bit, thankfully. And so now that we have Zoom and telehealth, people can access services now that they previously were not able to access. So it's more readily available than ever, thank goodness. So that's one option, is utilizing telehealth. Oftentimes you can get fairly inexpensive, if not free, and there are a lot of free resources, by the way, especially some of the nonprofit or government agencies, community health centers. They do offer telehealth sometimes, so worth checking that out. Just do some internet research, find out what the nearest resources are to you that are available. Also, if there's ever any kind of crisis, there's usually state and national crisis hotlines you can reach out to get immediate help. And just those should be able to satisfy the needs of most people. In other situations where it's just still people are falling under the cracks, which unfortunately is possible, one thing I would recommend is bibliotherapy. Y'all familiar with this?
Mm-mm.
I want to take a guess at what, just parsing out the words.
What are you thinking?
Well, biblio's book or library, something like that. So just like reading or doing like worksheets or like.
This is not therapy by going to the library, but you're on the right track.
Okay.
Although you technically could, because it is about reading self-help books.
Okay.
And
Okay.
libraries have lots of books.
I don't know, going to the library is therapeutic for me. Just walking around.
It is, yeah.
A little bit.
Yeah, and also like the act of just getting out, going somewhere different too.
No, you mean like reading self-help
But
books
yeah,
that are
like
designed.
actual like reading self-help books. Okay. What is there any specific like kinds of self-help books so like that people should go to or avoid?
Well, there's a lot of them out there.
Yeah.
It really depends on what you're dealing with.
Mm.
And so you can find stuff at the library. A lot of stuff is online now too.
Mm-hmm.
And even for ones that you're technically supposed to pay, oftentimes, they end up getting posted on some website. But there's a lot online that you can access, and there's tons of good books for every kind of condition that you could think of, and whether you're dealing with anxiety or stress or depression, there are lots of pop psych books
Mm-hmm.
on it and lots of self-help ones. So I encourage folks to check those out. And also sometimes you can get good ideas about things to try out and experiment in your life by reading the professional literature as well. So there's the popular psychology writings on a topic, but also the scientific research you can check out. But we call this bibliotherapy, and a lot of people benefit from it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How what would you say is like one of the most common like self-diagnosed disorders that maybe you've seen or heard of?
Well, the most common mental health conditions are anxiety and depression related disorders.
Mm-hmm.
And so because they're so common, my instinct would say those would probably be two of the main ones that people would self-diagnose, as a lot of folks deal with it.
Right.
I have seen some research in the literature indicating that that is the case, and specifically depression has been one that was found to be most self-diagnosed, along with generalized anxiety disorder. And so because the base rates in the population for those two are so high, people that are self-diagnosing will have a greater likelihood of actually being correct,
Yeah.
even though they might be incorrect if they were diagnosing something else.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I would say is I discourage the use of self-diagnosis for a number of reasons, and it's generally going to be less accurate than if you go to a professional.
Mm-hmm.
And you want the right diagnosis. That's important. And you run a lot of risks and dangers if you rely on self-diagnosis. One thing is, what are you using to diagnose? Are we sure that this is reliable information? If you're using websites you're finding online, there's a lot of out of date websites that are antiquated. They have old information that has long since changed. It will no longer be relevant or true. But if you're self-diagnosing, you may not realize some of these factors. Also, people can end up underdiagnosing. Maybe they think something's not a problem when in fact it is, and a professional would be able to tell this person so. You also run the risk of overdiagnosing, thinking you have something that you actually don't, or you have a whole bunch of different conditions that actually are not true.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes this can lead to things like being hypochondriacal, where you think everything's a sign or symptom that you have a new mental health condition. This also happens for medical students when they go to med school. They leave school thinking they got 10 different life-threatening conditions.
Yeah.
So just those are a few caveats to watch out for, and don't want people panicking about things that they may not actually need to panic about.
Right.
Also, if you're self-diagnosing, you end up with the wrong diagnosis, you could end up going out and, when you do get a chance, seeking treatment, but you're seeking the wrong treatment because it's the wrong diagnosis.
Yeah.
And also that if you end up given incorrect symptoms based on something that you read to diagnose yourself, when you meet with a professional, they're going to have incorrect information on which to base their diagnosis. And also, you run the risk of confirmation bias, where, if you've decided, well, I definitely have obsessive compulsive disorder, let's say, as an example, and then you do end up going and meeting with a professional, like, no, actually, I don't think you have that. I think maybe you have something else over here. We might be less prone to accept new information from a professional. And also, if we're in the habit of self-diagnosing, and then if you start talking about it with other people and normalizing it, then you start, what's to stop folks to starting to diagnose their friends or family?
Yeah, then spreading misinformation and stuff. Yeah.
So it takes a lot of years of training to accurately diagnose, and going to graduate school and clinical supervision and practice and licensure and all the rest of it. And the purpose of licensure is to protect the public, to ensure that people who are diagnosing and treating clients are qualified and credentialed to do so, so that they're not causing people harm. We just don't want people who are not equipped to do that. Unless you have the right diagnosis, you're not going to get the right treatment. And we want people to have the right treatments. The last thing I would say, and I know you had posed this question earlier about why do I think people tend to get drawn toward self-diagnosis.
Yeah.
And I think there's a number of reasons. Some of it overlaps with a few things we had touched on earlier, but it's free. It's quick and it's easy. And so, yeah, you'll save time and money in the short term, but you may not in the long term if you're not getting the professional help that you need for something. And So just I think it's a natural inclination for all of us to want to be able to figure out what's going on with me, and as much as possible try to solve our own problem, which is good. That shows self-reliance and motivation. But I always say it's a sign of strength, not weakness, being willing to reach out and speak with a professional. And I think it's very much worth that extra bit of effort, despite the time or the money.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Schubert.
I thought it was interesting that you could probably find a correlation between the fact that, well, it's a matter of opinion, the most frequently self-diagnosed disorders are also the most commonly diagnosed. So you could probably land on two sides of an argument of either saying, oh, they're just doing that because it's popular and that's what is so prevalent, or you could say it's the most common. Most people have it. There are going to be people out there who have it who don't have a professional diagnosis.
And then also, like we kind of mentioned, is that a lot of it would depend on like the resources they have available and the access people have. So whether you might not have the ability to go get clinical help or a diagnosis, or you might not have the money, resources, time.
Yeah, I keep going back to the online quizzes because I see so many times people take an online quiz and be like, oh, no, I have this disorder. Or worse, they like take it for someone else. And, like, I've seen that happen. Like, they take it for a friend or like, hey, let's do this. And then it's like, oh, now you have this.
Yeah.
And it's just frustrating.
That's rough.
But
yeah, I'm sure you've definitely been in those classes where, you know, at the beginning there's always that disclaimer from the professor. They're like, okay, we're gonna learn about these disorders or something, but don't diagnose yourself or someone you know. This has been
Psychanooga. I'm your co-host, James Grant.
And I'm your other co-host, Bethany Cawthorn. Thank you for listening.